Hello there, I'm Jimmy Vegas and this is how to create a first-person shooter in Unity, and welcome to episode 10. In this tutorial we're going to focus on post-processing. Don't forget, click the subscribe button and click on the bell icon as well to stay up to date with every tutorial still to come in this series and everything else on game development on my channel. With that in mind, let's get to work. So let's spend a few minutes discussing what post-processing actually is. For many people who are new to development in general, they may not fully understand what the term post-processing actually means. In a nutshell, it's a way of applying some effects on the screen to enhance the visuals. So we've already played around with the visuals. Obviously, we've played with normal maps, we've played with materials and changed things around, but we can go that extra step with post-processing and make it look even better. So what I would like to do is actually add the post-processing package. Now it's probably worth noting that I already have quite an extensive video on post-processing, so we're not going to cover absolutely everything in this tutorial. I will link my massive video on post-processing below if you want to go a bit more in depth, but we're going to cover everything that would make this game look better than it does right now. And it'll also give you the guidance to go further and make your post-processing look even better. So firstly, let's add the package to our project. Let's go to Window and let's go down to Package Manager. Now this will load, and already you can see that I have installed it, but let's imagine that you are opening Package Manager for the first time. It may look a little something like this with your packages already set to my assets, and you'll notice there I dropped down that little menu and it changed from Unity Registry to my assets, as you can see there. So this menu here is actually a really good way of splitting out the different packages and assets you can bring in. So everything you see here is something I brought in from the asset store, and if I click this little drop down menu again, you can see we have things like built-in, in project and Unity Registry. So we are going to set it to Unity Registry, and if you scroll down this list you will find post-processing. Now I already have it installed as a package. I did it before I started this video just to kind of speed things along so I don't have to wait to bring in the package. But down here you'll see install or something to that effect. All you would need to do is click it and it will bring in everything you need for post-processing. Once that's done, you can close down the package manager. And if we come down here to the project window and click on packages, we should be able to see that we now have post-processing. So there's lots and lots of files involved in this, and we don't need to worry too much about most of them because, to be quite honest, it's a lot more advanced than we probably are as developers right now, unless obviously you are a highly advanced developer. You probably know what most of everything in this means. Either way, let's get this set up so as we can use it correctly. So first things first, we need to go to post-processing and then post-processing again and runtime. And you'll notice this has a couple of scripts and a couple of objects that we can use for post-processing. Now what we need to do is we need to add a special layer to our camera to be able to basically visually see this post-processing. And to do that we need to go to the object that has our camera attached, and that is our first person character. So let's click on first person controller, let's click on first person character, and over here you'll see you've got tag, and over here you'll see you've got layer. We need to now change this from default to a brand new layer. So let's click the drop down menu and let's click on add layer. And here in the next free layer that you can type in, by default it's probably going to be layer 8, but you can put this in any layer as long as you know which layer to use. All we need to do is call it post processing. And if we click off it and then click back on the camera just to make sure it does appear, let's click on the menu again and set post-processing right there. And yes, change children too. It's not really going to matter whether you do change the children or not, because either way it is the camera itself which is going to be the important thing. And I guess we could always set everything back, if we wanted to. If you do get the case where something appears a bit crazy, something's not looking right or something, you can always play around with these layers, setting the children, which is the ones further down the list, or the parent, which is the top level one. So in this case, the top level is set as default, First person character is set as post-processing, and the others are set as default as well. So for now, as long as we have the first person character set as post-processing, that is fine. So 2 things we now need to add to this first person character. If we look through these here, you can see that we've got post-processing debug, we've got the layer, we've got a profile, and we've got the volume. There are 2 things that we need to add to our first person character, and that is the layer, which is this one. So drag and drop onto first person character. And we also need the volume, which is this one. You can see the name down here. Just need to drag and drop that as well. So both of those are set and ready to go. So let's go to our first person character now, and you can see here we have this post-process layer, and it's telling us that's the trigger. That's fine. Layer is currently nothing. We have to set that layer. So if we select that drop down menu and click on post-processing, what this is doing is it's telling this object that anything on the post-processing layer that we've named is going to be affected by whatever we place in our post-processing volume. So where do we go from here? We've got all set up. That's fantastic. How do we add some of these effects? Well, if we go further down to the post-processing volume, we need to click is global. And we then need to click on profile here. You'll see new. So let's click on new. And what this will do is it will create a file which contains all the values that we're going to use for post-processing. And you can see this profile right here. If we click it, it will place a new object inside the scenes. See here? It's in this folder up here. Now, this is the asset that we use. Now, we can add the effects here directly to the object by clicking Add Effect, or we can add them over here also by clicking Add Effect. It doesn't matter whereabouts you add them as long as it's on this specific profile, because this profile is what controls all of the global visuals. So before we go any further, let's also make sure that we're able to see any changes in our scene view. You don't necessarily have to see it in the scene view. You will always see it in the game view, but let's just make sure we can see it in the scene view. We can go up here and select the menu and just make sure post-processing is ticked. So it's this little box here, and you can toggle it on or off. So let's now set this post-processing into motion. Let's click on Add Effect. Let's go to Unity and let's start with ambient occlusion. Click the arrow next to ambient occlusion and then we can change everything. Like I say, I'm not going to go massively in depth. I'm going to tell you what you need to know to make this look better. But as I say, if you want to know a lot more about this, check out my video, which is, in fact, I will pin it in the comments. So it's pinned right there. So what we're going to do is we are going to add some ambient occlusion. What is ambient occlusion? It's a way of shadowing areas where light would otherwise struggle to get into. So, for example, this corner up here, light would struggle to get there. So it creates a bit of a shadow effect to make it look deeper and darker. If we click all, everything is selected, and then we can increase the intensity. So you can see as I increase the intensity now, the corners are getting darker and shadowier, as it were. So depending on how creepy and eerie you want this to look, you would play around here, which is the intensity. You can change the thickness to make it even more so. So you can see that basically it's impossible to see anything now. And if I do click in the game view, you can see how much of an impact that has. That's way too much for what we need. So obviously the intensity needs to be reduced and the thickness modifier needs to be a bit lower than that. But we can see that, yep, that's looking a bit better. So again, this is probably something that you should play around with. We can also change the color if we want. We can make it bright red. Black is usually the better color to use because that's the one that creates that shadowy effect. So let's click Add Effect again. Let's go to Unity. And let's go to bloom this time. Bloom is a way of really highlighting and exposing colors in different objects based on the light source. So once again, let's click all and let's play around with a couple of different things. If we increase the intensity, we can see here on the barrel that that is really being affected. So I don't think we need to have the bloom intensity too high, but if we press play and spin ourselves around, you can see the bloom effect is really having an effect over here. So if I tell you what I'll do, if I just leave that frozen there and we play around with our effects. So let's play around with the bloom. Let's increase the intensity. Let's decrease the threshold. You can see how much of an impact that is now having. So the reason this is occurring is the threshold is extremely low. In other words, it's non-existent. So it kind of, think of it as if you have a lower threshold, then the less light is required for it to bloom out. So you could theoretically decrease this very slightly, like so. And you can see how much of an impact it's having. But remember what I said, it's occurring with light sources, which is why we're not seeing much of it over here. And I think it all comes down to how you want your game to look. Sometimes I like to go way too far with bloom, but that is just me. So the softening also controls how the bloom is affected. If you want a weird psychedelic kind of feel to the game, you can play around with it. You don't necessarily need to have all of these options on, but playing around with them certainly helps with how the vision of the game can be. So you can see there, because I've changed it, it now looks kind of cartoony because I've played around with it quite a lot. So if we click these three arrows up here and click reset, we can actually set that effect back to its original state. So let's have the intensity on, let's have the threshold on, let's play around with the softening. In fact, let's have all on, just for all intents and purposes. You can turn things off that you don't actually require. It's entirely up to you. Also worth noting that if we change anything here, it does actually save in the settings. So previously with other things in the game, if you move an object while in the game playing mode, it won't save. Whereas anything you change here in the post-processing volume will save. So let's increase the intensity to 5. Let's decrease the threshold to 0.9. So we have a little bit when we turn around. And let's keep the color as white. And let's keep it as is. I'm going to turn texture off and turn the intensity off. Okay, so I'm going to stop that game mode now. Okay, let's add another effect. Unity, and let's go to color grading. Now, color grading is what really brings everything forward here. It really adds that extra level of visualization to the game. When combined with bloom, it really stands out. So if we click all, and it's up to you how you want to do this. You can change it from HDR to LDR. It doesn't really matter too much, but this is a great moment for me to actually go to the camera itself up here. So I've scrolled up in the inspector panel and the rendering path. Let's now choose deferred. So deferred will basically allow you to see the game even better visually, but it will use up slightly more resources. It's up to you whether you want to have it, just absolutely entirely up to you. And MSAA, I'm actually going to turn off. We're going to add some anti-aliasing with the post-processing. So MSAA stands for multi-sample anti-aliasing. As I said, we'll add it in our post-processing. Okay, so let's go a little bit down here, and I'm going to change the mode from none to, let's change it to neutral for now, and let's increase the temperature. And you can see that really has increased. It looks crazy, and there's the tint that we can change. So you can really change how this now looks. So it looks like we're in some kind of biohazard shooty, nuclear, something or other. So yeah, definitely worth playing around with the temperature and tints because you can really bring out a slightly different visual of the game. Post-exposure, if I increase this, you can see just how much that really brings it out. To me, that's way too much, but you can also go negative to make the game visually darker, even with the same amount of light. And you can see, if I really bring this down, it reduces it quite a lot. Color filter, we can change. Again, if you want it bright red or whatever. Keeping it as white keeps it its original color. Having it black means you can't see a damn thing. A little bit further down, you can change the hue if we want to. You can see that's playing around with how it looks color-wise once again. And set it back to 0 to keep it as default. Now, saturation and contrast. These can really help bring out everything in a game. You can see here I have increased the saturation quite high, but if I bring it low, it's a black and white effect, and that's kind of cool. So I'm going to have this all the way up to 100, and the contrast, you can see if we bring it down, it kind of just looks not very good, a bit muddy. But if we bring it up, we can really see how much of an impact it's now having on our game. So at this point, I'm going to press play and have a quick walk around to see how our game looks. Cool. Okay, so let's keep going. You can play around with the channel mixer. Basically, you can modify the colors once again. That's what it really comes down to with the color grading. You can see the kind of effects you can create here. So depending on certain images, you can really pull out different colors and hold back other colors, and it gives a completely different effect. So I'm going to hold Control, press Z to undo that, and put it back to its original. And let's go and add another effect. So add effect, Unity, and let's add some grain. Let's make this a bit spookier, I guess. So yeah, grain allows you to place some grain on the screen. So if we tick all and change the intensity, you can see the grain does appear on the screen. You can change the size of it. I mean, if you change it all the way up, you can see just how grainy and a bit ugly, to be honest. You see? So I'm thinking I want to have low grain. I'm going to have it not colored, so it's going to be standard. There we go. And a little bit of grain should do the trick. Okay. Again, play around with these settings however you want to. Add effect, Unity, and let's go to motion blur. So motion blur you'll see in quite a lot of modern games for various different reasons, but basically that gives you the opportunity to kind of blur the motion when you look around. So if we tick all and press play, let's have a look at the default value of this. So you should be able to see already the motion blur. And if we modify these values all the way up, you can see how it has changed. So let's undo and let's bring the values all the way down. To me, I'm not too convinced with that. I actually quite like the default on this one. So I'm going to keep those values as it is for a little bit of motion blur. Next, let's add vignette. Now, vignette adds a kind of extra area around the screen, which kind of brings a bit more focus. So you'll see what I mean when I tick all and change the intensity a little bit. So you can see here around the outside of the screen, we have a fairly faint black area. Be a bit more apparent if I go here and start changing the intensity. You can see it's fading into like an eye kind of shape. And you can change the value of this. You can make it rounded if you want to. And obviously that would bring in a much more rounded shape. But I prefer to have it not rounded. And obviously you can modify the roundness here. So if we put the intensity all the way up and decrease the roundness, it becomes a letterbox kind of view. Now that's a cool effect to have if you're going for a kind of retro style feel. So if you want it a bit retro-y, if that's a word, you can. So I'm going to have the roundness just under half and the intensity round about there, just so I have a little bit of vignette. Let's have a quick wander around. Cool. So let's add another effect. Let's go to add effect, Unity, and what do we have? So going down the list, there are a couple of other things that we can have here. If we click auto exposure and click on here, now this is, I don't think this is quite necessary. If we click all, and if I look at it, we can change the filtering, but I don't think auto exposure is quite necessary. As I said, if you want a bit more detail, The link is in the pinned comment. But this is a chance for me to actually show you that even though we have an effect on here, we can actually untick it so as it doesn't render on our screen. So if it's unticked here, we can't actually see it. So let's now close some of these up. Let's close the color grading, the grain, motion blur, vignette, bloom, and ambient occlusion. And you can see that we can easily access some of these options now. So let's click Add Effect, Unity, and there are a couple that we haven't actually had on yet. A quick overview here. Chromatic aberration is a way of kind of distorting how the visuals look. What I always reference with this is Resident Evil Revelations 2. There are enemies in that game called glasps, and whenever you get close to them, the screen goes fuzzy and a bit hazy and a bit wild. That's a really good example of chromatic aberration. So if you want to use that effect or want to look up that effect, just reference GLASP from Resident Evil Revelations 2. Depth of field, obviously, that's pretty self-explanatory. Lens distortion is, again, pretty self-explanatory. And screen space reflections. Let's add this, and already you can see how much has changed in the scene. If we untick it, that's fine. But if we retick it, you can see there is a lot that's changed. So let's tick all, and let's reduce these and set this as 1. And you can see it affects it. So basically what it's doing is it's relying on light to kind of create, you could think of it in simple terms like reflections, hence screen space reflections. I don't think that's quite necessary in what we're creating. So once again, I think we should turn that off. So that's a brief overview of post-processing and how it can really affect your game. Now, obviously, this looks a little bit dark and gloomy, and maybe I'm not quite comfortable with how it looks. Best thing to always do is to go over what you've already created and modify it. So, for example, ambient occlusion. Let's untick ambient only. Let's reduce the intensity, and let's reduce the thickness modifier. So you can see that we have modified it very slightly. Let's go to bloom. Let's increase the intensity slightly, and let's keep the threshold as 0.9. Let's close them up. Let's go to color grading, and let's change from high definition to low definition. And let's, what should we do? Let's decrease the brightness very slightly, and let's decrease, in fact, I don't think we need to worry about the contribution. Let's bring the temperature down slightly. What else can we change here? In fact, let's set it back to high definition and change from neutral to ACES. You can see a couple of different things changed from neutral to ACS. So again, I really think it's worth playing around with a lot of these particular settings to really see what you can come up with. So because I've changed it to low definition now, I think we can go back to ambient occlusion and increase the intensity. That's all good. Let's go to, in fact, let's go one step further with all this. Let's go to our scene and let's go to our light source right here. And let's actually move it over here and go back to our game view. And you can see how much that has now had an impact just because we've moved the light source. So post-processing works well with the light source that you have. And one good thing that I always like to do is always highlight the player in certain situations. So for example, if we were to add a light to our player right now, we'd see something slightly different. So let's go to the first person controller. Let's right click. Let's go to light and let's go to point light. And let's bring it forward and upwards. And we can see in the game view, if we increase the intensity, how much of an impact that has on our player. So I'm thinking we should increase the intensity, decrease the range, and shift the light ever so slightly in one direction. So it's going to slightly be this way. And let's press play. Okay, so there we go. Now, as I said, this is a very, very brief overview of post-processing. It's definitely worth playing around with so many things here. I mean, I really can't stress how important it is to take your time and just play around with figures and settings to make this game look as good as you want it. Another thing which may also affect how it looks visually is the materials themselves and the normal map. So if I change this normal map to 1, in fact that's set to 0, you can see that it just looks, it just doesn't quite look right. So it's definitely worth playing around with those normal maps to see what you can come up with. And the same does apply if we change the normal map to a grayscale. You can see it just looks crazy now. So I would honestly recommend playing around with the lighting, the materials, as well as the post-processing volume itself to see what you can come up with and what you can create. I may change a couple of things between now and the next tutorial just to make it look maybe a little bit better, because I've just sped through this a little bit. But you should definitely take the time and play around with these settings to get the game looking how you want it. In fact, one thing I might do is reduce the grain. I think it's a bit too intense. There we go. Okay, so in fact, I'm going to reduce the size of these barrels as well. I think they're a bit too big. They are definitely a bit too big, aren't they? Okay, so next tutorial, what should we do? What can we do next tutorial? Okay, what we'll do next tutorial is we will create some animations on some doors. So let's, I think that's too small now. Let's create some sliding doors, basically with some animation that we can go through. So what I'm thinking is here, let's have some big doors that open for us so we can go through to the next area. So until that next tutorial, guys, thank you very much for watching.